Hello, my name is David Johnston, and I'm a practicing psychologist in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. I participated in the PhD degree program at Pacifica and received my PhD in clinical psychology in 1996. The title of my book, and here's a copy of it. The title is Individuation and the Evolution of Consciousness at the Turning Point and Jung's Challenge. I guess I'm going to try and give you an idea of how this book developed, but it's really an expression of my own individuation process. And it began when I was living in India at the Sri Aurobindo ashram, where I immersed myself in the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And one of the books of Sri Aurobindo that I actually ended up teaching was The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. And this is basically concerning the evolution of consciousness. At the same time, I'd like to say that my mentor when I was living there was a man by the name of Arindam Basu, and he taught me an awful lot about Sri Aurobindo. And at the same time, he also had met Jung on two occasions. Once was when Jung was in India, in Calcutta, at the University of Calcutta, and later Arindam taught at Cambridge, and he went to visit Jung at his home in Zurich. So this is an important point because it shows you already the connection between Sri Aurobindo and Jung, which comes across in my book here. After the Sri Aurobindo ashram, I spent a year at the Jung Institute in 1975, which was Jung's birth centenary. And incidentally, I was at the Sri Aurobindo ashram in 1972, which was Sri Aurobindo's centenary. And while I was at the Jung Institute in Zurich, I met James Hillman. And to my surprise, I learned that he was considered by many, including the director of the Jung Institute at the time, Guggenbuhl Craig, he was considered to be the most creative Jungian. But what I found in the lectures was that he showed some irreverence towards Jung, and that disturbed me. And so that's, as you'll see if you read the book, that became something that I felt I had to work through. I also at the time had a dream of Erich Neumann. In the dream, he was on a gurney and he was sick. And my therapist at the time, Cornelia Brunner by name, said to me, well, Jung thought very highly of Neumann, and he considered that he was going to replace him when he passed away. And as it turned out, as we all know now, that Neumann actually ended up passing away before Jung, even though he was 25 years younger. But he was definitely considered to be a very brilliant disciple and very close to Jung. And when he came to visit Zurich, what happened was that Jung would put him up on the platform with him as an equal. He thought so highly of him. But in my dream, I dreamt that he was sick and on a gurney. Now, I understood this to mean that two things. My inner Neumann was not well and needed to become better educated, let's say. But over time, I began to realize that Neumann himself is representative of the Western culture in many ways. And that in that sense, his thinking, even though he's brilliant and creative, his thinking actually diverges from Jung in some very essential ways, and that in some ways I can say the sickness is connected to the sickness in the Western psyche. So that's something that I took with me over the years. And I ended up many years later studying at the Pacific Graduate Institute, and that permitted me, it was a great education, and it permitted me to reflect on my experiences and to prepare myself to be a psychologist as well. But interestingly enough, the person who oversaw my dissertation at the time was Patrick Mahaffey, who is now, I believe, the chair of the mythological program. But interestingly, he himself knew Arindam Basu because Arindam had gone to California on a tenure to teach in a university, and Patrick is assistant there, I guess I would say. And so it was an interesting synchronicity that Patrick and I met at Pacifica, and he oversaw my dissertation that has become a book. I had a dream of Jung where I hand Jung the Synthesis of Yoga, which is written by Sri Aurobindo, and he leafed through it, and he said in my dream that he was a very impressive looking Jung, by the way, and he said that that's exactly what he's written. So I've kept all of this in mind, and these ideas have, informed me. These dreams have informed me over a very long period of time. So what I did many years later was I worked on publishing the book, which was a major process in itself, I might add. And it's all connected to Pacifica, as I think you can see. My whole argument is that we are now at the turning point where the major shift in consciousness, in Sri Aurobindo's language, we've come to what he calls a subjective age. And the subjective age has a shadow side, and the first side of that is turning inward, but you might say turning inward to the narcissistic ego. But the deepening of that is what Jung brings us, and that's the individuation process. So Jung is about individuation in terms of the whole culture individuating, but also, as we know, about the individuation process of the individual and how the individual can participate and is really eventually responsible to participating in the evolution of consciousness. In that way, the individual becomes a co-participator in the creation of consciousness. And that's the essential point that I'm trying to make in the book, and I'm trying to argue through it. And I argue through the whole development of the Western psyche, because as Jung always pointed out, we can look to India, and it's got a great deal to teach us, but eventually we have to look at our own culture and our own psychic roots and work with that. And that's what he did, and that's what I try and do here in the book.